Well, all right. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here, a little after 6. Thank you all for coming. We're really excited. This is our last program for the Old Growth Celebration we've been doing here at the library for the last month. And we're very pleased and excited to have Dr. Joan Malouf here tonight to speak. Before that, I just want to thank again all of our partners who were involved in this. Thank you so much to Eric Jensen, fine art graduate student whose work is out here that you can see. This show was largely his inspiration. Thank you also to Dr. Diana Six for helping us along the way so much. And thank you to our partner Spectrum here in the building for participating with us. Thanks to MCAT also for being here to record all of these programs so folks can watch them later. And thank you very, very much to Sandy Shepard for hosting Joan while she's been in Missoula. It's been an absolute delight to work with everyone. So without further ado, Eric is going to give an introduction for Joan.
Hello, everyone. Thanks again for coming out to celebrate old growth with us. Our next speaker, Joan Malouf, is the author of numerous research articles and 5 books, Nature's Temples, Treepedia, The Living Forest, Among the Ancients, and Teaching the Trees. In addition to her research and writing, Malouf founded an organization with the goal of creating a network of protected forests across the U.S. That organization, the Old Growth Forest Network, now has hundreds of volunteers and thousands of supporters. Malouf works to educate others regarding the extent and condition of our forests and to encourage their protection. Her formal education includes a bachelor's degree in plant science, a master's degree in environmental science, and a doctorate in ecology. She is a professor emeritus at Salisbury University, where she taught biological sciences and environmental studies. Without further ado, Dr. Joan Malouf.
Thank you, everyone. My water bottle. Thank you, Eric, for the introduction. I'm visiting here from Maryland, where I live, but I'm going to share with you my thoughts about the forest and about the organization and a little bit about our advocacy work for the forest, too. So when we talk about old growth forests, we're talking about forests that have not been cut. So they've not been considered a commodity or cleared for agriculture. Or if they have been cut, they've been cut so many hundreds of years ago that they've been able to recover their full developmental structure. So if we look at globally where we are with forest cover, first of all, the forest cover has declined on the planet from 46% to 31%, and that's all due to one species, ours truly. All the clearing and desertification, all the development, all the places that used to be forests that are going to be forests no longer. But there are places that have been cut where the forest has regrown and recovered, and it's just a younger forest and a different forest than it once was. So on this map that you see, if you pictured the yellow and green as all being green, that would be the forest cover on the planet. So not every place has forest cover. But the yellow are the places where the forests have been cut and then regrown. And we call those second growth forests, where sometimes in the very productive places, we are now on third and fourth growth forests. The green areas on this map show where the still uncut forests on the planet are. And those are mostly the areas that are either difficult to get to, such as the deep tropical jungle forests, which we're making inroads to quickly and removing, or the boreal forests, where the trees grow so slowly and are so small that they haven't really been a target for logging. Now, looking just at the US, these graphs were made in 1925 by the first head of the U.S. Forest Service. And in the upper left there, it says area of virgin forest in 1620. So this is what they used to call old growth forest, virgin forest, and that kind of not too popular. So we changed it to old growth forest. Around the world, they're often called original forest or primary forest. That's another very popular term for these forests that haven't been cut. So in 1620, there were certainly people living here. There were native people here, and they used the forest, and they cleared some areas of forest, and they were having influence on the forest. But the forests were not thought of as a commodity to be traded. And it was not until the Europeans came here, the European settlement, that all of a sudden the forests were a commodity, and they were being shipped all over the world. In fact, even on the Mayflower, when the pilgrims came, they were told, okay, after you get off the ship, load the hull with wood and send it back. Because in Europe, they'd already cut most of their forests by that point, and the island nations had too. So you can see by the 1800s, the old growth, especially easy to get to, was being taken out very quickly in the east. Especially the big white pines and the loblolly pines and the longleaf pines on the coast. And then by 1920, the lower bottom right picture, that by then the western expansion had occurred, and now the western forests were being hit really hard too. And on the east, where I'm from, a lot of people think, oh, they at least they saved the redwoods, because they've been in Muir Woods. And I have to tell them, no, 98% of the old growth redwoods were cut. But by the time they were really hitting those forests hard out west, we already had the history in the east and saw that almost all the forests, the old forests, were removed. So the conservation organization kind of caught up then with the cutting, and were able to stop some of the cuttings and protect some of the groves, including the sequoia, which were being cut as well. And today, so the 1620 map is the last map of this series. They were made in 1925, but of course the cutting continued since then, especially when there were wars like World War II. That's another excuse to cut any of these old groves that were left. And some of you may know of old groves in your lifetime that have been cut. So every decade since this map, 1920, forests were cut, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, up to today, to the point where we only have 1% left in the east and 5% left in the west of what we truly consider old growth forest. These photos of me are not with old growth trees that were cut down. They are with second growth forests that are cut down. So these are a mix. So when the original forest got cut down, maybe that land became a farm field, or it became a grazing area. And then some of those places were abandoned and forest grew up naturally, because certain places on Earth, that's what the Earth wants to do, is grow forests. So these forests have regrown, second growth forest with all the native diversity, because there was seed source still there. There were other trees nearby to share their seeds. And so that forest I'm sitting in front of was a second growth mixed native forest in Maryland. So there would have been oaks and hickories and maples and ash trees in there. And now it's going to be cut and become really a pine plantation, because pine is what grows the fastest there and brings in the most money. And on the right, those are oak trees that came from a wildlife management area in New Jersey. And they're about 120 years old. So they're a second growth forest. Now it's a very fascinating time to be involved in forest work and to talk about forests, because not really a person that likes conflict. In fact, at one point I was teaching conflict resolution, but it really feels like there are two sides out there right now. We don't want to make anybody the enemy, and we want to try to understand each other and educate each other, but it's really interesting to see. And I put the book cover of this book called Strangely Like War by Jensen up here, because that's what it feels like at times. It's like the bad guys and the good guys. And I think, some people think of me as the bad guy, and I think of them as the bad guy, but we're all just trying to understand each other. So I've kind of pictured us both here, both the sides and the extreme. And so the forest managers are often called in because people may own a forest, or it might be a public forest, and they feel like, gee, I don't really understand much about forests, and shouldn't I be doing something to this forest? Shouldn't I be taking good care of this forest? And they'll call in this person who's the county forester maybe, and the county forester says, yeah, you want to take down, all these, well, where I live, it's beech trees, because they're not worth anything on the market, and you want to let the oaks and maples grow, and so, yeah, you want to get these out of the way, or they're all too close together, and you want to thin them out. And then there's the ecologists, like me, on the right side going, well, what about the salamanders? What about the old growth? What about the snags that are habitat? So the folks that are really interested in cutting forests for income, that want to keep them as a commodity and feel that their job is to get the most wood fiber out of a forest that they can, and they're trained to do that, realize that words like clear-cut logging have become very unpopular. And now they'll use terms like these. You have to do this for the health of the forest, and we're going to regenerate the forest. And now instead of clear cuts, they call them restoration cuts. And they're doing it to improve resiliency for climate change. So this all becomes very confusing to people that are really trying to understand. They hear these words and they think, oh yeah, I want health of the forest, I want resiliency. But often these words are used by the timber industry without true definitions and without science to back up what they're saying. So I would say if you hear these words, just kind of beware. Ask what definition they're using and ask to see the research. And this situation of trying to educate people on what's really happening is what influenced me to start writing books about the forests and letting people know that, when you take out the beech, and when you take out the maple, and when you take out these species, you're really taking out a piece of the biodiversity of that forest. And on this trip, I'm celebrating the brand new release of this big book I'm showing here, Large Nature's Temples, A Natural History of Old Growth Forests. And I call this my geeky science book because what I did was went into the scientific literature to get back up, or scientists don't like to say proof, but to have studies that show what's better for a forest, this sort of management that the industry is saying, or leaving it alone. So that's what I'm going to talk about mostly tonight, is this book. So do forests need to be managed to be healthy? First thing we need to remember is that the forests have been around much longer than we have. So this is the history of life on the planet. It's kind of, I don't know which one to point to, but that bottom spiral there was a long time that this planet existed before there even was cellular life, and then cellular life evolved, and it was all in the sea, and then photosynthesis evolved, and multicellular sea creatures evolved, and by the time you get to that top green line that I put on there, that's when the first forests evolved. So soon after life came out of the sea, really, onto the land. At first there were the tiny plants, the algae that was coexisting with the fungi, and that's how they could stay alive. And then there were just the spore plants. And then the plants got bigger and bigger. And that's what a tree is. A tree is just a plant that's over your head. And the trees that existed then 350 million years ago were very different. They were different than the species we have now. They're kind of like tree ferns. And none of them still exist of those species. And then as that spiral continued, different tree species evolved, and then tree species that had seeds, and so they could live in a drier climate. And the forests were so successful, they actually changed the atmosphere by all the carbon that they absorbed, and may have actually been a key in some of the ice ages because they took in so much carbon. So many other organisms evolved with the forest, and then that bottom green line there is when humans evolved. So that was just about 4 million years ago. So if you think forests need humans to be healthy, just reconsider this graph. But now that we have evolved, we are having a great effect on the forests that are sharing the planet with us. So this dotted blue line shows global forest area from 1650 to present time. So as I already shared, the global forest cover is declining because of human actions. And we know this from the United Nations. Every 5 years, they come out with a new report about global forest cover. And the rate is slowing down, but we still are losing forests every 5 years. And also at the same time, we know our global carbon dioxide levels are increasing. And the two are somewhat related because forests remove about 1/3 of the carbon from the fossil fuels that we burn. And so we're releasing that carbon into the atmosphere when we burn fossil fuels. And the forests are doing their best. They're removing 1/3 of it, but they can't remove it all. So if we really want to bring down that CO2 level, we're going to have to do twofold approach. Not burn as many fossil fuels and let the forest cover increase. I'm going to run through, this is kind of the crib notes from my book, if any of you are old enough to know that term, the crib notes. So this summarizes about half of the book in one thing. I'm going to run down it. So comparing the older unmanaged forests to the younger managed forests, or we could think of them as the industrial production forests. And the older unmanaged we can think of as the old growth forests. So what I did was I dug into the scientific literature, and any scientist who compared older and younger forests, so old growth and managed forests, what did they learn from whatever they studied, whether it was carbon or salamanders or lichens and so on. And I tried to put that information into a easily readable form for people to understand. So that's what my book is all about. So starting with carbon storage, the older unmanaged forest has higher carbon storage, no matter how it's treated. So the unmanaged, for instance, in this one paper, the northern hardwood forests sequester 39 to 118% more carbon than any of the active management options evaluated. So on this graph, which you can't read, I didn't really mean for you to read it, that red line shows the carbon that's stored in an uncut forest. All those other squiggly lines under it that are dashed in different colors, those are different management types. So it could be thinning, or it could be shelter belt cutting, or it could be clear cutting and regrowth. But you can see that none of those management options store as much carbon as the uncut forest. And this is newer research. This was 2016. And this research, very important, talks about carbon that's released from forests due to different causes. So people will say, well, you cannot cut the forest, but then what about the forest fires? What about the insects? What about the wind-thrown forest? So this graph, the top left shows the carbon released, and the darker the red, the more carbon released from harvesting. Top right is fire, and then converted means development, then wind damage. Down the bottom left is insect, and then drought. So forest harvesting accounts for 85% of the carbon released from forests each year. And it's over 5 times the carbon that's released from all the other things altogether. You know, we can't really stop the windstorms and the droughts and the insect invasions, but we do have control over the harvesting. So regarding old growth forests, it used to be believed that they were sort of carbon neutral, that they would grow and they'd store carbon, but then the trees would fall over and they'd rot and they'd release the carbon. And many people thought that they were kind of a steady state, including me way back in the day. But now more and more science is coming out to show us that these old growth forests are continually accumulating carbon above and especially below ground, because before we weren't really taking into account how much of the carbon was being stored into the soils. And it's like 45% of the carbon that a tree is taking in. And there's a whole ecosystem underground that we're just barely beginning to understand that uses that carbon being brought in from the atmosphere. So there's the carbon piece, and then there's the biodiversity piece, comparing the older and younger forests. So salamanders, I'm just going to go through this really quick, and if you want the details, you can read the book. You're going to find more salamander species and more numbers of salamanders in the old growth forests than in the younger managed forests. Lichens, same thing. More species and more lichens in the old growth forest. So these images here are these tiny little, you can barely see these with the naked eye. The researchers that study these don't even try to look for them in the field. They'll just be collecting pieces of bark and things and bring them back into the laboratory and put them under the microscope and then identify them. I never even, with all my education, I never even heard of these little things, these calicoid lichens. But the researchers that do know about them, there's not that many, what they say is the older the forest, the more species of these that you'll find in there. So, for instance, someone who's the expert on these in the US works in New England, and in the old growth he found over 20 species of them, but in the younger forests he would never find, he'd usually just find a few different species of them. Then the beetles, many more beetles, more species of beetles in the old growth forests, and there are some other insects that are only found in the old growth forests when researchers compare. So that means if you cut those forests, you're creating an extinction event for those insects. Mushroom species, same thing. If you like mushrooms, they're getting more and more popular, and people just love to walk out in the forest and see them or look for edible mushrooms, and you're going to find more of them in the older forests. And many of the mushrooms that you see in the older forest are the above ground fruiting bodies that we can see of the underground mycelial networks. So more mycelial networks in the older forests too. And that's what this picture is showing. This white fuzzy stuff connecting the trees is a fungal mycelial network. And that network is not only going out and obtaining minerals and other nutrients for the trees, because the fungi have different ways to collect those minerals. The trees can't do that themselves. And the fungal network is bringing that back to the tree roots, water and minerals, we'll say. And then the trees are bringing in the carbon that they've converted to sugars and sending that down to the roots to feed the mycelia. So it's a beautiful symbiosis, but then the trees can also communicate with each other through this mycelial network. Using the word communication, I don't know, maybe a no-no for a scientist. Some people would say, well, they share things, but we don't know why, whether it's on purpose or whether it just is. But how does this relate to the age of the forest? So this picture with the circles there, that's from a paper from Suzanne Simard's group, and you might have heard of her. She wrote a book called Finding the Mother Tree, and they did the most groundbreaking work about this mycelial network to find how the trees share. And the dark green circles there are the oldest forests. These are Doug firs. The medium green are the medium-aged forests, and the light trees, and the light green are the younger trees. And what they found was that the older the tree, the more other trees it was connected to, and also the more different mycelial genets they were connected to. So this one of these big old trees was connected to 47 other trees underground, and to 11 separate mycelial networks. So, okay, what happened there? Eric, do you want to see if we can figure out? This one maybe? Tech support. Thank you. Okay, snails. You know, these little creatures we barely even think about. And I was wondering this myself. It's like, well, what are the difference of the snails populations between the older and younger forests? And because they're not really an economically important thing, hardly anybody has studied them, but there was this one master's degree student in Kentucky, and he decided he was going to look at this, and he found the oldest forests he could find in Kentucky and compared them to some matched younger plots of forests, and collected all the snails he could find, identified all these snails, and he found that there are more snail species and more individual snails in the old growth forest, and that there are some species, such as this tiny little white thing the size of a grain of rice, that's only found in the old growth forest. So again, if you come in and say, oh, we're going to regenerate this forest, or we're going to improve its resiliency, you're wiping out those little snails. And the same with what we can call herbaceous plants, or herbs, or wildflowers, whatever you want to call them, the little blooming plants on the forest floor, mostly has negative effect on the population of wildflowers. Now, many of these forest floor plants do need some sunlight, and they're not going to bloom without sunlight. But in an old growth forest, you will naturally have gaps where one of these big old trees gets very large and it's taking up a big part of the canopy, but it's not going to live forever. And it's going to eventually die and fall over, and that's going to create an area maybe half the size of this room of sunlight where then these flowers can bloom and grow. So that's the kind of light diversity we do need in a forest. We don't need heavy equipment to go in there and say, oh, we're going to put some light in this forest. So we have the information, right? We know that the old forests do everything better, and they're very important for biodiversity. But then what do we do with that information? How do we try to save these old growth forests? So I was working on a book where I visited one old growth forest in each state east of the Mississippi. So this is eastern old growth, which never gets any attention. Everybody's always coming out west to see the old growth. So it's like I wanted to show them there was a little bit out in the east. And so I was driving around, one old growth forest to another. I couldn't do it all the same time. I'd take like spring break and I'd go to 3 different ones, or I'd, do a couple, and I'm driving hundreds of miles sometimes between each of these little plots of old growth and thinking, wow, we really wiped this stuff out. We were really efficient at wiping out this old growth. But who's protecting what's left? That's the question that came to me. And if there's only 1% in the east, 5% in the west, we can't let any more of it go. And I think we need to let some more of our second growth forests come back and recover and become old growth again. It's not going to happen in one lifetime. It's going to take generations of people working on this to make it happen. So that was my vision, that we need to protect what's left, let some recover. And then I thought, what if we made sure that there was at least one forest that was protected from logging and open to the public and relatively accessible in each county? Then we would have something that we could really measure. Instead of just going, oh, save the old growth, we could go, okay, we're going to try to save one in each county. And that idea became what I called the Old Growth Forest Network, because it would be a network throughout the whole country. And then I went and Googled counties in the US and went, oh my gosh, there's a lot of counties. But they can't all support forest growth. And right here in Montana, you have some counties that can and some counties that can't. And so what we're aiming for in the counties that can support forest growth, to have one forest protected from logging, open to the public and accessible. And it's not all going to be old growth right now, because there isn't old growth in each county. But where there isn't old growth, we'll take an older second growth forest and try to make sure that's preserved. So that's the mission. Started about 10 years ago. And I was the first employee and the only employee for a while. Now we have about 4 full-time employees, 4 part-time employees, but it's still a big job for our small team, and so we have to rely on volunteers in each county to look around their county and to try to find the best forest for their county. And once we are assured it's protected, we dedicate it into the network. We have a hike and a ceremony. It's so fun. And Eric is our volunteer county coordinator for Missoula County, and he's in the process of looking right now. So if you have any ideas that you want to share with him for older forests in this county, he'll go look at them and he'll share them with us. Also, if you know of any old growth forests in this state that you think would be good for this network, I have a map over there of the state, and you can just put a circle on there and you can nominate that forest that way. We take all kinds of nominations. Or if you are associated with another county, maybe you go there for recreation or go up there or something, and you want to be a county coordinator for that county, welcome you to sign up and do that. That's how we do it. That's how we have hundreds of volunteers now across the country that are helping us with the forest. And if you do want to be involved, you can fill out one of these cards. And even if it's just to stay connected with us, because then when we do, like when Eric does finally find the forest and we do have the dedication, then we'll invite everybody in the state, whatever state we're in, doing the dedication to that dedication. Or if there's other talks or events. So I like to think we're not just a network of forests, we're a network of people who care about forests, and we're trying to build that too in the country. So where are we now? 191 forests are in the network now in 33 different states. And we're growing fast, and what's the matter with this picture? That's right, that's right. And that's one of the reasons that I came all the way here, and I'm so happy to be here, because I'm in the East, I do a lot of talks in the East, and we are very popular there. And then in California, I spent a lot of time over there. And then Ohio and Pennsylvania, oh my gosh, they're like in a race. They both want to be number 1, and they're adding forests every year, and they don't want to let the other one get ahead. But I didn't have any connections really in Montana, so you're my first talk here about the Old Growth Forest Network and reaching out, and this is where we'll start and grow it throughout the state. If you're interested in where the other forests are in the Old Growth Forest Network, here's our website, oldgrowthforest.net. So let's say you're going to be going to Indiana and you want to know what old growth forests you can visit there, or Ohio or California or Alaska, just go on the website, and these are all open to the public forest. Like I said, relatively accessible. And we also create resources. I will write these papers about like forests and carbon or forests and human health and all kinds of issues, and you can see those resources on there. And there's a donate button on there too. We are entirely supported by individuals that just believe in the mission, or small foundations, usually family foundations, that are very excited by it. And people have been generous, and they've been supporting us. And that's how we could grow our staff. Okay, here's your counties. I'm hoping your wheels are turning. There's a lot of them, right? We have a lot of work to do. We'll also figure out the counties that don't have any forest cover, and we'll color them out, so it's up to you guys. All right, so beyond the Old Growth Forest Network, the Old Growth Forest Network also gives us a platform from which we can speak out for forests, threatened forests across the country, and make a difference. So this photo here in this newspaper article, that's me with a giant red oak tree. This is in Maryland. The piece of old growth forest closest to where I live is 60 miles away, and it's only 14 acres. It is in the state park system, but Maryland state parks are not protected from logging. It's a true old growth forest, recognized by the state as old growth, but still not protected. So it couldn't be in the network. We don't let any forests in the network unless they're firmly protected from logging. So I was so frustrated that I couldn't put this forest in the network. It was just perfect for the network, except it wasn't protected. So we introduced a bill to the Maryland House and Senate, required that whenever our DNR identified an old growth forest on state land, it had to be managed in a way that prohibits logging. So yes, it passed, yay. That was last spring, yeah. So we were able to dedicate that forest into the network. So that's how we do it. It's interesting because we went to every state, the Natural Resources Department is called something different. In Maryland, it's called the DNR. So we went to the DNR. I even know the woman that was the head of the parks and said, look, you need to protect the old growth forests in your parks, or protect your parks from logging. Oh, nobody wants to rock the boat or make any changes. They want to protect their jobs. So we found that if you go to the politicians, who can speak out against old growth forests? So that's why, and so it passed by a wide margin. I was happy to see that. One of the things that we're dealing with now, this is New Jersey, a wildlife management area that was bought with, one of these green bond funds, and it was this huge forest. It wasn't old growth; it was second growth forest. This is the one I showed you in the beginning of me sitting next to the 120-year-old oak trees. They came out of here, and so this was a large contiguous forest, which is important, and they were cutting it to create young forest, right? Wildlife habitat, to open up the forest because it's healthy, right? These are all the reasons that they give for it. And we know what's going to happen here is invasive species are going to come in, cowbirds are going to come in. This is not good for this forest, not to mention that it's public land, and a lot of the public wasn't in favor of this. And this is this movement that's happening now all over the East and the South and the Midwest. It's called the Young Forest Initiative. Have any of you ever heard of this? Okay, so it's really, so it's the public relations firms that come up with these terms. They're the ones that start talking about, said, oh, talk about resiliency and health. This Young Forest Initiative, they'll call it wildlife habitat improvement or to increase young forest cover, which is pretty funny. How are you going to do that? By taking out the old forests. Regenerate diverse vegetation, all these reasons. Really what they're wanting to do twofold. One, they see all the mature timber standing there that's worth some money and can't stand it. They want to take it out and sell it, but they're not saying that. And two, by creating these clearings, it's good for some of the hunted species, like the woodcock, grouse, and the quail. These species naturally like early successional habitat. So we'll take out the trees and we'll have early successional habitat for these birds so then they can be hunted and killed. So the hunting groups are all in favor of this, and they're lobbying the government, which then gives a lot of money for these cuts to happen. Now, I'm an ecologist. I have nothing against early successional habitat. I personally don't really have anything against hunting. But what should not be happening is our older forests being cut to create this kind of early successional habitat. We have plenty of other places where naturally the early successional habitat happens through the fires or the wind, or even places that get, like grazing places that get abandoned. Those are the places that if we want early successional habitat, we can get it. And so this got so frustrating to us that so many cuts were happening in this name of Young Forest Initiative, and it sounded so good that we decided we're gonna write a paper that questions this. And these are some very well-renowned forest scientists that went in with us as co-authors. And this paper just came out in January, and it's being called a landmark paper. So yes, so this is how we can make a difference. So this is our message: no cutting for young forests. Also, the thinning thing is going crazy because the fires have been so destructive as our climate changes. And so people naturally, like, we have to do something about the fires, and they'll tell the politicians, we have to do something about the fires. And then the Forest Service says, well, if we thin, then the forest won't be as bad. But when you dig into the science behind it, this is a really interesting time, and there's a lot of strong feelings on both sides. But what I'm finding from reading this is that the more trees pulled out of a forest, the more quickly and intensely a fire burns. So all of this thinning to try to protect the communities is actually not protecting the communities. The fires that are happening now with the droughts and the climate change are being propelled by winds and the embers, and they're really going, when they get in a community, they're going house to house more than they're being spread by the forests. So really we just have to harden the houses. We don't need to cut the forests around the community. So what's happening with these thin forests, it's drier there, and the fire can move more quickly through that area, and the wind can get through there more quickly. And yes, you can find papers on both sides of this issue, but some of the things that have convinced me is when you look at what we call Gap 1 or Gap 2 areas that really are strongly protected, they have the least intensive fires in them. So keep your eyes open. If you want to read a book about this, I'd suggest Smokescreen by Chad Hansen. And again, Chad, he's done the science work, but Forest Service people will tell you, no, he's crazy and he's out there. But I'd say just do more research and make up your own mind, but don't just believe that the thinning is the answer. I think sometimes thinning is suggested because it's just like it feels like something is being done. And also then the timber is taken out and sold. Okay, and now the federal government is paying a little bit more attention to what's happening to the old growth. So last year on Earth Day, President Biden said within 1 year, he's ordering the to identify old growth, define old growth, identify where it is, complete an inventory on federal lands. And we were like, yes, the president is talking about old growth forests. We've never heard a president talking about old growth forests. And also, we should have had an inventory of where the old growth is on our federal lands, on our forests. We should have known that. There was no such thing. People were coming to us and asking us where the old growth map and inventory was. And we're like, oh, it doesn't exist. So on Thursday, so this was an executive order. We gave them 1 year. On Thursday, they came out with the report. And in that report, they have definitions for old growth. And it's different definitions depending on the region and the forest type. And they did a survey that they said 18% of the federal forests meet their definitions for old growth. And he also said not just old growth, but mature and old growth. And 45% meet mature. So mature is important because we have to let some of those forests recover for carbon and for biodiversity. I think they did a pretty good job on the defining. It was a hard job. They just had 1 year to do it. And also on the inventorying, although there's no great map yet that we can use as individuals to really see. We're depending on their forest inventory data. But what comes next now, and we're very excited about this, and this is where we need everybody's help, who's a community of forest lovers, is now that we've defined it, inventoried it, now we need a rule that says old growth forests on federal land will be protected. And so, I was just on a Zoom meeting today. We have coalitions of forest groups that are focused together in how can we encourage our federal government to make such a rule. So every voice counts on this one. Yeah, so this is what they came up with. All righty. These public forests need to be preserved as strategic carbon and biodiversity preserves. There's plenty of private forest lands out there where they can sell their timber and they can do the thinning, but our federal lands are important. There are a lot of Forest Service projects that are already rolling. They've already been approved, that include cutting old growth and these massive thinning projects. One of them is the Black Ram project. You all know Rick Bass, who was here earlier. He's been very involved in this. This is the Black Ram up in the Yak. This is old growth forest. We need to protect it. And I have hope that the Forest Service maybe we'll see the light. This photo is from Oregon, where it was called the Flat Country Timber Sale. It was one of these timber sales that would include old growth, and they got the Forest Service there to take that cut off the cutting plan. So there are these particular cuts that should not happen, and we're hoping we can hold them off until the new rule. So it's going to take all of us. We got to stick together, save the older forests, build a community of people who care about them, and hope you'll stay connected with us too. Thanks for your attention. Yes.
Is there money behind this federal?
Yes. Behind, you mean the rulemaking thing and all that? No, not yet. Not yet. But there's a lot of government money behind the thinning. It's called, restoration and community protection. It has nice names like this. It's part of the infrastructure bill, and there's billions of dollars that are encouraging this thinning. So, yes, back there.
Are there certain scenarios where thinning might help prevent some fire? Not obviously the old trees, but near home, some of the underbrush. Are there certain scenarios where you might agree with it?
Within 60 feet of a home, and this is just what I read, within
It's just
60.
confusing, when you hear different things.
I know. It is confusing. That's how I say it. So I had an earlier version of this book that came out in 2017, and the press wanted to put out paperback, expanded, revised, and I had decided to add a chapter on fire.
Wait.
Had to read all this, and it's confusing, but there's a lot of, some of our instincts are wrong on that. Like people think, oh, the insects come in and the trees die, those trees will burn faster. But that's actually not true. A green tree will burn faster than a tree that's been killed by beetle damage, because the beetle damaged trees, a lot of the fines, like the needles, will fall off, and that's the part that's really flammable. And in the green needles with the oils, very, very flammable. So one of these green trees will catch faster than the beetle-killed trees, which isn't instinctual at all. Or people will talk about the underlayer being a ladder to catch the top of the taller trees, to bring the flames up. But with these kind of firestorms where the embers are carrying in the wind, it really doesn't matter, because the tops of those trees are going to get embers anyway into them. And I'm not saying, if it's old growth, it's not going to burn, because I've seen, it's been awful. But even if thinning had a positive effect on these communities, the thinning that the Forest Service is doing, only 1% of the forest actually came in contact with that thinned area. And it's very expensive too. And how often are you going to keep doing that? It's going to grow back in 10 years. We can't afford to thin around every community. So we just have to harden the homes and keep the forests intact. Thanks.
I just want to point out that there's a film out going around. It was even shown yesterday here in Missoula, called Elemental.
Mm-hmm.
Elementalfilm.com.
Yeah, I've seen that. Elemental.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good
of
film.
Information which you were pointing out some of the facts.
Yeah, thank you for reminding
Very well
everybody about that.
science-based.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. When this came out a couple of days ago about protecting the old growth, I did not see an article in the Missoula, which surprised me, but there was one in the Independent that came out on the 22nd. And it says protecting old growth trees, and it goes into the whole thing about how many square miles. It claims that the survey that was done had 50,000 square miles between the Forest Service and the BLM, 50,000 square miles of old growth forest, and about 125,000 square miles of mature forests, according to the inventory. And it said that's more than half the forested land managed by the two agencies. And it covers an area larger than California. Now, clearly, that's not true. I've been trying to ask people where a lot of us here, several of us here are involved in the Forest Plan Revision, and we have these things called ranger chats. And that's the way we participate. So we've been trying to go because we're retired, we don't have anything better to do. And I guess that question, and like really, they don't know. They might say 3%, they might say 10%, but there's no way that we have 10%. You probably know, Jeff, what percentage of the forests in western Montana?
Well, Joan just had some statistics up there earlier about 5%.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so they're talking about 18%?
Okay, so let me clear that up. Yeah, I can clear that up. So one, the inventory, how much old growth forest is left in Montana and where is it? I got a phone call about 2 years ago, and it was sounded like a young man that wanted to know that. How much old growth is left in Montana and where is it? And I said, well, you know what? That's a very good question, because I have no idea, and I don't know if anybody does. And maybe you can be the one to help start, that and figure it out. Was that you?
No.
Okay.
I have a statement about that when you're done. though.
Okay, wait till you're done. So, the number I'm using for all the West, 5%, closest we can get. Now, those numbers that you just read, that came from this Thursday's announcement from the federal government, this inventory that was going to be done. And the press got it ahead of time, by the way. I'm like, how did that happen? They get it ahead of time, so they were ready to release a statement on the day it got released. And so what they found was 18% of the federal land is old growth. And that doesn't mean never been cut. It just means using their definitions, which I thought were pretty good, 200 years old for this species and this big and that. So we'll take that. I'd rather them be liberal in their definition than really restrictive. So 18% on federal land, because most of our old growth that's left is on federal land. So let's say it's 18% on federal land and 1% on private land. So that's okay, I'm okay with that. And then the mature, a good amount of forest, but most of that, at least half of it, they're calling the pinyon pine juniper ecosystem. Yeah, they counted that all in to make, and why is that still old and standing? Because it hasn't been, doesn't have the industrial value. So there it is, covering millions and millions and millions of acres, and they're saying there's old growth, there's a lot of old growth. And I thought it was interesting that article made it sound like there was so much old growth when, most of that is the pinyon pine juniper. It's not really untrue, but it's not.
I mean, it's really dangerous for those type of numbers to be coming out and people to think
Yes.
that much older.
Yeah, and think that we're fine, that we don't, yes, exactly, yeah. So we just have to keep,
And of course,
Speaking
we have,
truth to-
we have wilderness and we have
Yes.
national parks where it's not
Right.
being cut. But
that's all part of that number.
Right, and any places they can have cut, places that they can manage outside of wilderness and national parks, what's left there?
Right. They didn't come up with those numbers. They haven't, because we don't have that
That's
inventory.
like GIS
Yeah,
exercise.
yeah. And so you could also reverse it in half of our federal forests are not protected from cutting. So most of it, if it's outside wilderness and it's outside the parks, it's mostly not protected. Okay, maybe, you wanted to have one more comment.
Well, most of us probably remember, looking around this room, most of us probably are old enough to remember the spotted owl controversy in the late 80s and the early 90s, which resulted in forest planning in the Pacific Northwest. And in 1989, the chief of the Forest Service actually put a direction out to all the regions and all the national forests to inventory all the old growth in 1989.
Right.
Inventory all of the old growth. Well, it didn't happen then, and with the politics even more contentious now, I can guarantee it, the outcome of this is not going to be an accurate old growth inventory where there'll be maps where you can go and find out where it is. They don't want, the government is too corrupted by the timber industry. They do not want you to know where to go and hug a tree, where these old trees are.
And yes, I agree with you. And these are they're public forests, they're our forests. So we can go there. We can do the inventories ourselves now if we have to. We have the definitions. All right, we're going to end there, and I welcome you to sign up to be involved with us.
Are you selling
Things on the
books
map.
here?
No, you can get them wherever books are sold, but we're not having books. I flew here, so I couldn't carry
We have
many.
a couple of local bookstores. Did you go and do any signings at either?
I didn't. Before here, I was in Seattle, and I did do a signing there. But I'm just gonna have to come back. Right?
Thank you.
Thank you.